Hey guys, in today's video, I'll teach you how to deal with forms in React. We're going to be going over things like form error handling, so holding on to the actual dispatch of the form submit until all of our fields are valid. We're going to be dealing with things like how to show custom error messages, how to create our own validation rules. So I'll just show you guys a couple of examples. So this is the little app we're going to be making. So here you can see we have a username and a password, and I've set both of these fields to required. So if I was to hit login now, nothing happens, and when the login is successful, you actually see a console log here. So you can see here we get nothing, but we do get these specific error messages where this one says this field is required. So let's type something in. So if I type in test and I hit login as well, you can see this time we don't get that error message, but this one still persists. I've also created another rule where I've set the minimum value for the username to 3 characters. So now if I set it to 2 and I hit login, you can see we get this error message. This field must be at least 3 characters long. I've also created another validation rule, which is it has to be less than 10 characters long. So you can see here we get a nice error message. This field must be less than 10 characters long. And these error messages are something that you can customize, so we're not going to be using any third-party dependencies. And in addition to that, I'm going to show you guys how to create your own validation rules. So these are just 3 rules I created, so minimum length, maximum length, and required. You could also create your own ones like checking the format of the actual input. You could do something like check if it's an email, check if it's valid, or whatever you can think of, you can create here. So just to show you guys how this works, if I was to type in something like test, and the password, I've only put the validation of required. You can see here, we get this login. But now if I was to, once again, not fulfill all of the validation rules, you can see that we get an actual error message. So let's get started by creating the basic boilerplate. Okay guys, so to get started, then create your actual boilerplate. What you want to do is open up your code editor and also open up your terminal. In the terminal, you want to type in npx create react app and then specify whatever directory you want. So this will just specify the current directory. So I've already run this. As you can see, I've already run all of this, and this will give you all of the React dependencies, and it will give you access to the source folder. And inside the source folder, you want to head over to the app.js, where all of our actual JSX and our React code is. So before we go any further, let's actually start up our development server. So you want to type in npm run start in your terminal, and this is in the directory where you installed the create react app. So this will just open up a new tab in your browser with the create react app boilerplate. So now we can close that. So the first thing I want to do is just clean up some of this JSX. So I'm going to remove that, remove all of this, and then create a basic form. Then within this form, we're going to create our own input field component, which is going to handle all of the validation and all of our state for that specific input field. But just before I go any further, I want to actually open up the app.css. I'm going to remove everything here and paste in my own CSS. So this isn't a video about CSS, that's why I'm not going to go over all of this. But so I recommend you guys just copy and paste this from the Git repository. It will be in the description. So moving on, the first thing I want to do is actually create this input field component that's going to be reusable, where we're going to be able to set validation rules. And I just want to show you guys now an example of the validation we're going to have. So it will be something like a string that we can put in, and we can put in fields like required and then separate them and then say min. And I'm also going to show you guys how to create max. So a field that has this validation on it would be required, so it cannot be empty, a minimum character length of 6 and a maximum character length of 12. So I'm going to be showing you guys how to do that and much more. So let's create our actual component. So I'm going to create a folder here called components, and then create a file called input field. So let's import React, and I'm going to be using functional components. And just remember to export as default the component. Okay, so the basic JSX that we're going to put inside of this is going to be an input, and this can just be a close tag. So I want to input, and I'm actually going to create some default props for this, because all of the props, all of the values for this input are going to come from props, so that we can give all of the access to the properties of this input field to our parent component. So I'll show you guys what I mean. So let's do input field.default props, and this is just going to be an object. So within this input field, I want a couple of things. So the basic ones are just going to be placeholder, and I'll just write them out, and then we'll fill them in. Placeholder name, onChange, the type, something like text or number, the value, the autocomplete, which isn't required, but I like to have this off generally. So let's fill these in. So the placeholder, by default, I want this to be just empty. The same with the name. The onChange we're not actually going to do here. We're going to do it in the in its own function. The type, by default, I'm going to set to text. The value is going to be empty, and autocomplete is going to be off. So now if we just put these in here, what we can do is props.placeholder, props.name. This I'm going to leave out for now. We're going to deal with that next. And it's going to be props.type, which is by default going to be text, and props.value. Okay, so now let's create some state to deal with the value of this input field. So I'm just going to say value and set of value. We're going to be using the use state hook. And initially I want this to be empty. Now let's deal with the onChange. So I'm going to create a function here called handle change, and it's going to accept the event object. So now what I want to do is whenever there's a change, I want to actually call that function. Oops. I want to call that function, but I'm going to do it as an anonymous function. That way what we can do is pass into handle change function the event object. So the event object is passed to us by JavaScript, and so we're going to pass this event object into our handle change, and here I might as well just call it event as well. And then I'm going to set the value to the event target value. So that's going to be the actual value that the user types in. Next up, I want to pass this value up to our parent component through the props as a callback. So it might sound weird, but I'll just show you guys. So we can do props.onChange. And then I want to actually pass up two things, the name and the value. And the reason that we have the name here, but we don't have it here, is because we don't actually care about the name for this input field, because we already have the value. And what we're validating is going to be the value. Although we haven't wrote the validation yet, but that's just so you know why we need the name for this one, but not the name for set of value. So to get the value, the name, what we want to do is event.target.name, and I also want to give it the event.target.value. So now, this is just very basic, and one more thing I want to add is a label. That's optional. So let me add a label here. Actually, we don't need to have it as a default. We can do props.label. And then if we do have it, might as well just use the label tag and just say props.label. So now if we pass in a label prop, then we'll put this here, and then we can style this as well. So now in our app.js, I actually want to call this, so input field. And remember this, I automatically import it here, but in case your editor doesn't, remember to import it. And let's give it some values. So the name, this one I want to be username. I actually want a label for this, so this is going to be username. The onChange we're going to leave to a bit later, and I don't want a placeholder either. Actually, let's do the onChange now. So to store all of the values of the input field, well, in case we want multiple input fields, we need to actually store all of those values. So the way we're going to do that is have an object in the state containing the key value pairs. So I'll just show you guys what I mean. I'm going to create some state called data and set data. I'm going to be using the set state hook, and initially I want this to be an empty object. So now what we want to do is create a function to handle the change of each input field, and this is just going to be one function that will handle the change for all your input field components that you have. So for example, we would have another one of these, then the same function would apply. We wouldn't create separate functions for each input field. So I'm just going to call this handle change, and I'm going to pass the onChange here to handle change. And if you remember, like I said earlier, we do pass the name and the value. So here we get the name and the value. So what we can do is set the data, so set the state to, and in set, and whenever you use this set anything in React hooks, you can actually either set the value directly here, or what you can do is type a anonymous function, and the parameter that you get here is actually the previous state. So in this case it would just be empty, but in case we have actually already wrote something in, this will be filled up, and we want to maintain the old state. So prev would give is what I'm going to call the previous state, and what we return is going to be an object. So I'm just going to do this inline. So if you use a pair of parentheses and then the curly brackets, we're saying we're going to return this object. So that's what this means. And what I want to return is the previous data. So I'm going to spread in the previous data. That way we're creating a copy of the previous data, not referring to it by its address, but instead referring to it through a completely brand new copy of it. And then I want to set name to value. And here we're putting name in square brackets. The reason for that is if we were to just create a normal object, whatever you set here is actually going to be the key, but if we were to put in square brackets, it would be whatever the variable is assigned to. So in our case, we don't want name equal to the value. We want the value that the variable name contains to be set to the value. So that might sound a little bit confusing, but all I'm trying to say is whatever this name here is, it's going to be put here, and the value of whatever the user inputs is going to be the value there. So that's just all that is. So this way now we have the actual value of this input field in our data. So even if we had to have multiple and call them something else, like password, both of these values would be kept in the data. So now what I'm actually going to do is console log data. Then if we open up our app, we forgot to fill in the autocomplete. So it's going to be props.autocomplete. So you can see here we have the username and password. And I just forgot that we need to make sure here, I'm just going to give this a class name of input wrapper, so that now we have the styling applied. So now one thing that I actually forgot to do was that this value here currently is coming from the props. So we're not actually setting a value. And so what you'll notice is when we type, we're actually only getting the first character and it's not even storing it. And that's just because I forgot to actually set up a ternary here, where if the props value, which is empty here, is empty, then we actually just want to rely on the local value. So props.value, then we want to use the normal one. Otherwise, we want to use the value from our local state. So now if I type in, you can see we get username and then we get password as well. So this shows that our local state is actually capturing the correct data, and our state from our parent component, the app component, this data here actually contains all of the data of the input fields. So now let's move on to actually validating these forms. So to start validating it, we're going to be using references. So what we can do is grab forward ref and use imperative handle. And what we're going to do is remove our entire component here and then write forward ref. And then within the parentheses here, I want to paste in what we just cut out, which was the entire component. So now our component is wrapped within forward ref. So what we have access to now is, if I was to, we have the props as normal, but we also get the ref. And what that means is we can assign an object or object containing methods to this reference. And the way we do that is using the use imperative handle. First argument for that is the ref that we get here. And the second one is a anonymous function where what we return is going to be passed into this ref. And then we can use that in our component up here. So it might sound a bit confusing, but I'll just show you guys. So what I'm going to do is create a method called validate, and it's going to call an anonymous function, which is going to call validate. So let's actually write that validate function. So for now, all I'm going to do is say return true, and I'll show you guys why we're going to be returning either true or false to show whether the input field is valid or not valid. And then in here, all we want to do is create that reference. So we're going to be using the, let's just call this input refs. And then we're going to be using react.useRef. Now, for just one input field, we can just use, say, ref is equal to input refs. But the problem is we have multiple input fields. So the way that this works in hooks is a little bit strange. So what we have to do is within react.useRef, we have to create another reference, and the number of references we create is equal to the number of input fields we're going to have. So here, what I'm going to do is react.createRef, and it's actually, sorry, it's going to be an array. So let me just make sure that's an array. There's going to be an array of references. So here I'm creating one ref, but I know we're going to have two fields. So let me just create another ref. So the slight limitation with this is that if you have a dynamic number of input fields, such as the ability for users to add more input fields, then this would be a little bit tricky, and you'd have to actually use some smart logic here to potentially map through something and then create the references dynamically. But here I know that I have two input fields, and therefore I'm going to have two references. And then what I'm actually going to do is assign these references. So ref is equal to input field refs, but it's not going to be actually equal to input field refs. And the reason for that is if I console log input refs, you'll see that it's not actually, you'll see that it actually doesn't work out how we think it would work out. So I'll show you guys an example. So here you can see in the console log, we get current, which is an array of 2, but we can actually see that it's not an array of 2. So the reason for that is we don't say ref is equal to input refs. We have to say ref.current, and then we have to specify the specific index. So for the first one, I'm just going to say 0, and for the second one, I'm going to say 1. So now, and this is meant to be a full stop. So now you can see we have current, which is actually an array of 2 and does contain two refs, both containing a validate function, which we created here. So what we can do is, if we create an onSubmit on here, and then if we create a button to handle that submit, let's just call this login. Then what we can do is give this a type of submit. And then let's create the actual submit function. For now, I'm just going to say console log submitted, and then pass that here. So now what we're going to do is use these references and then use the validate function here and validate each field, and then see whether or not we should actually continue and perform whatever this form is supposed to do. Such as in this case, if it's a register form, then register the user. For example, call out an API request. So what we can do is loop through the React, the references. So the way we're going to do that is, first just remember to prevent default here. So with the event object, prevent default. So this is just to prevent the page from reloading. That's all that does. So what we can do is I'm just going to create a variable called isValid, And by default, let's just set that to true. And you'll see how this works. So then we're going to loop through our references. So while this is less than this, I think it's input refs dot current dot length. So we're just seeing the length of the how many how many references we have. So in this case it'll be 2. I just want to increment by 1. Then within here, what I want to do is say valid is equal to, so we're going to say input refs dot current I, and then we have to say dot current again, because if you remember, each reference has its own current property, and we want to call the validate function. So for now, all I'm going to do is console log valid. So what we're doing, ignore this for now. This is just what we're going to be using later on. We're saying loop through all of the input refs we have, and then within those, I want you to run that specific input field's current validate. So it's going to run through each input field. So it's going to go through this one and then this one, and then it's going to run this validate function, which we haven't completely wrote yet, but for now it's just going to return true. And then we can create a little if statement. So if valid, then if not valid, then set is valid equal to false. Then here we can say if it's not valid, then just return. Otherwise, carry on as normal. So I'll show you guys what we actually get here. So I'm just going to console log valid, and this will run on the submit. So right now we're saying true for both of them. So you can see we're getting 2. And then if I set this to false, we're getting false. And then what we can do is, let's say here, console log logged in. So currently they're both false, so we'd never reach that logged in. But if I set it to true, then we would actually reach that logged in. So all it would take is for one of the input fields to not be valid for this is valid function to actually be false. And what we might as well do for performance is just set, say, break, and this will break from the for loop. So that way there's no point in us validating the other ones. And actually I just realized this actually isn't true, and the reason for that is if we were to break, let's say we this input field was not valid, then we would never run the validation for this. So we wouldn't actually be able to know what kind of error message to display. So I'm going to take it out here. So let's actually create the validation now. So if I remove this, so let's just create a note. Return true if is valid. Else return false. So what I want to do is use this value here. And first thing we should do actually is just pass the validation string. So let's say if props.validation, and by default let's set that to empty. So if we say here something like validation, I'm going to say required, then min of 6, and then max of, let's say, 12. So what I want to do is separate out each one of these. So the required, the min 6, and the max 12, and then loop through them, check that each requirement is fulfilled, and then return true or false accordingly. So let's say rules is going to be equal to props.validation.split. So we're going to split it every time we get one of these. And then what we want to do is loop through all of the rules. So for I is equal to 0, I is less than rules.length. Do we want to increment I by 1? So the current rule, I'm just going to set to rules 0. So the first thing I want to do is just check for validation rules that are complete words, so don't have two parts to them, so just like required. And we could create another one like email, which would be another example of just single word rules. I'm not going to create the email one now, but that's just another example. So what we want to do is just first check for these whole word validations. So the first one is if current is equal to required, I want to check if the value is equal to nothing, then we want to return false. Otherwise we want to carry on and just see what other validation rules are on the actual component. So we don't want to actually break out yet, because there could be, like in this case, multiple validation rules. So if there's no value, then we want to return false, and this should be triple equals. So up here you do all of your whole word validation rules. So we only have this required one, but this is where you do other ones like email. Next up, we want to do the validation rules where there's multiple values. So here we want to split the min and the actual value. So let's do a switch statement, and let's actually create the pair. So I'm going to call it pair because it's going to be the requirement name and then the value of that requirement. So pair is going to be equal to current. So current right now is going to be set to this, and I want to split it at the semicolon. So current dot split at the semicolon. So now we have an array where the first value with the 0 index is going to be equal to min, and in this case here it will be equal to max, and the first index value and the second value would be actually equal to this value here, like 6 and 12. So I want to switch by pair and the name. So the first case is min, and then we can break. The second case would be max, and also let's break as well, and let's put in a default as well, where this will be for something that we don't recognize. I'm just going to break here. This is in case they write something like a typo here where this isn't valid, but I still want to pass it. So let's do the min first. So all I want to do is just check if value is less than min pair 1, so this value here, 6. So if our value is less than 6, and let's do value.length is less than 6, we want to return false. Otherwise we just want to carry on. And here, if our value.length is greater than pair 1, which is in this case would be 12. So if value length is greater than 12, we also want to return false. And what I realized is we should also capture these errors. So I'm just going to say create error. And we're going to be using hooks again. So what I want to do is capture all these messages. So before we return, what I want to do is set error to, and then here we can create whatever error message we want. So I'm just going to say this field is required. Then I'm going to copy this here and also copy it here. I'm going to say that this field must, and I'm actually going to use template literals for this. So this field must be at least, and then we can use the min value, pair 1 characters long. And if I copy that one here, this one would be this field must be no longer than, and then however many characters long. So that's for the max. So if we were to go through this again, so we check if we have any validation rules at all, and if we do, we want to split them. Then we want to go through each validation rule and first check our whole word validation rules. So in our case, we only have required. We see if it's required and if it passes this test, and if it doesn't, we return false. So we don't actually go through these other ones because we don't want to overwhelm the user and send multiple validation errors. you only want to show one at a time. And then we also want to return false to break out of this. We'll display the error messages in a moment. Let's just go through the rest of this. We next want to check if for the other validation rules, so is there a min? And if there is min, then we want to actually look at each of these values and see what is the value length, and is it greater than, and is it less than, sorry, the value that we set the minimum it can be. So in this case 6. So is the value here less than 6? And if it is, then we should show a message because this isn't valid. And the same thing for max. So if it's greater than the value here, which would be 12, we want to also show a message saying this field must be no longer than 12 characters long. Finally, let's actually display these error messages. So we're going to say error, and let's just create a paragraph tag displaying the error message. We're going to give this a class name of error. And then one more thing I actually want to do is every time we make a change, I also want to set error to empty. And the reason for that is just so the error doesn't stay there and look bad. So now what we can do is we can actually test all this. So here, if I actually open up the component, we can see here we get this error message saying I is not valid, and that is in this loop here. Yeah, so I just remembered that the loops actually have to start off with the word let, like we did here. I just forgot to add that in. And the actual rules cannot be 0, it has to be I, so we get the current rule that we're looping through. Okay, so now if we go through this, I just realized that I actually made an error. So you can see here we get undefined, and there's 2 reasons for that. First one is if we run through this validation function and everything passes, we reach the bottom of this if statement here, and we actually realize that we need to, this if statement, we actually need to return true. So that's because everything has taken place and we haven't returned false, meaning that it's valid. And the other mistake that I just realized was that I spelled validation wrong here. So now if we were to go through it, and if I was to click login, we can see we get false and true. That's because we haven't put any validation on this password, and we get a nice message saying this field is required. So if I was to type in something, you can see we get another message saying this field must be at least 6 characters long. And you can see that as soon as we type, this error message disappears, and that's because of the in the handle change we set error to nothing. And then finally, if I was to type something like that's longer than 12 characters, we would also get the message saying this field must be no longer than 12 characters long. So just to finish up the CSS, the JSX, we need to add in a div here. So we need to add in a class name of form, and then we can also put a nice h1 saying React register form. So yeah, this is our final finished project. You can see we have validation for this, and actually let's just add some validation here. So we're going to say it's required and a minimum of 6 characters long. So if I was to click this, we'd see these error messages. So let me type in something here. And then we still get the error messages because of this password not being fulfilled yet. So it has to be at least 6 characters long. So if I make it exactly 6, you can see it works and we go through. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Thanks for watching.